All right. And we are back. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Chacruna Psychedelic Liberty Summit. You are in track 2, and we are about to begin our 12:10 session. My name is Liana Gillooly. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today and to be moderating this extremely timely and important panel. We have 2 panelists today. Both are doctors who work in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and they will be bringing in the topic of the economics of ketamine, issues of money and medicine in treatment. So you are in the right place if this is what you came here for. And before we jump in, I just wanted to once again acknowledge the incredible work of Chacruna and the team. And I want to shout out Renee Roski, who's been our tech support, who's helping streamline and make all of this possible. And yeah, just huge gratitude to Bia for her ability to curate such incredibly powerful, timely, and important discussions. So moving into this topic of the economics of ketamine, we are going to have 2 speakers present, and they'll each present for about 15 minutes, and then that will leave us about 20 minutes for questions. So to begin, we have Dr. Raquel Bennett, who's a psychologist and ketamine specialist from Berkeley, California. She's been studying the antidepressant properties of ketamine since 2002 and is the founder of the KRIA Institute and organizer of the KRIA Conference. And she might cringe at me saying this, but I often refer to Raquel as the ketamine queen. So Raquel, please take it away.
Let's wait for me to load up. There we go. Hi, all. It's a great honor to be here today. Thank you so much for having us. I want to give a shout out also to Bia. Happy anniversary to Bia and Clancy. And also thank you to Liana and Renee and the entire Psychedelic Summit team who are volunteering their time this weekend to make this amazing event. Thank you so much. Anyway, yeah, we need to have a little chat about the economics of ketamine treatment. Oh, by the way, sorry about the COVID hair, but anyway, as Liana said, right, I'm a psychologist and a ketamine specialist. I've been studying the therapeutic properties of ketamine for about 18 years at this point. I'm also openly a ketamine patient myself. I've been using ketamine to manage my own severe depression for almost 2 decades. And so that's how I came to be interested in this topic. So this topic is really very close to my heart. I work in collaboration with a variety of medical professionals to provide ketamine treatments, and I do a lot of consulting for the psychedelics community and the psychiatric community also about ketamine treatment. So this is really my specialty. So let me just offer a few introductory remarks about ketamine. You may know that it is a synthetic chemical. It's actually a derivative of phencyclidine, or PCP. It was first synthesized in the 1960s as a human surgical anesthetic. And so that's its primary use in medicine, is as a surgical and procedural anesthetic. But it turns out that it has some interesting side effects, or interesting other effects that are important. For about the last 10 years, we have begun to appreciate that ketamine has rapid acting and short-lasting, but quite robust antidepressant effects for some kinds of depression. And it's useful also in the treatment of other psychiatric and psychological disorders or concerns. So that really is outside the scope of this particular talk, but let's just note that that's what we're going to be talking about. In addition, ketamine is highly psychedelic. Highly, what I mean by that is really mind manifesting. And in that sense, it's really a beautiful synthetic sacred medicine. When people are using ketamine correctly and the dose is correct and the setting is appropriate, ketamine that sometimes opens up a space that invites people to experience the sacredness or divinity of their own life and of life on this planet in a spacious and expansive way that's really quite unusual. Ketamine is a dissociative medicine and quiets the signal in your body. and opens up the spirit and mind and psyche for exploration. Ketamine also sometimes causes a temporary shift in your perception or relationship with reality. And in that sense, ketamine is really quite strange, and this experience is frankly not well suited to a lot of people. And so again, that is really outside the scope of this particular talk. But if you're interested in this, you can find more information about this on my website, Kriya Institute. Anyway, the focus of my talk today is really on the economics of ketamine treatment. And there's a couple of key problems that we need to name in order to have this conversation. So first of all, there's tremendous bias and prejudice historically in the medical and scientific community against psychospiritual experience. And this prejudice has prevented science and researchers from researching and putting resources toward and investigating certain questions that are critical to understanding the therapeutic properties of ketamine. This is really slowly changing. It's been changing in the last couple of years, but there's a lot of information that we don't have because of this fundamental bias in medicine. So we need to take that as a premise of this conversation. Some of the data is missing. We're still collecting it, number one. Number two, there is a huge systemic problem in the FDA approval process. And this is, people often wonder why we care so much about this. And here's the answer. I'm going to tell you right now. The FDA approval process is very intimately tied to medical insurance coverage. And the best way to get more accessibility for this medicine and other sacred medicines like it is to have medical insurance coverage for this treatment. You can only get that if it's FDA approved. So now we have to look at the fundamental flaws in the FDA approval system that makes it nearly impossible to get FDA approval for a cheap generic medicine like ketamine. And my colleague Alex is going to be talking about this further in a moment, but I just want to name that this is a huge problem. And another huge problem when we think about the economics of this field is that it's currently largely unregulated. And that means that a lot of people from a lot of disciplines can come into the field of providing therapeutic ketamine, but there is currently no standard curriculum for what they need to know in order to provide this, to work with this medicine in a safe way. And so frankly, we have some people coming into the space who are looking to invest or who are looking to provide ketamine, this or that, who really aren't qualified. They are not qualified to work with the population that ketamine is well suited for. So this is a huge problem, and this is something that also needs to change if we're going to go forward. By the way, there's just one other thing I want to bring up. I'm a little hesitant to even mention it, but I do want to mention one other thing while we're on this note, which is there's another problem that often doesn't get talked about, which is the fact that graduate level education is expensive and leaves students or graduate trainees in massive debt. So it's not unusual for a physician or a doctoral level psychologist to come out of training with $250,000 in debt in student loans, often in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this is a systemic flaw that needs to be addressed as we think about why professionals charge what they charge and why they need to charge that. So anyway, it's somewhat of a side issue, but it is relevant to this field. Anyway, here's the thing. The thing is that ketamine itself, generic racemic ketamine, it has FDA approval for use in anesthesia and analgesia, so it's used for sedation and pain management. Generic ketamine, the cheap kind, is not currently FDA approved for any psychiatric indication. It's all an off-label use, which is legal but controversial and tricky. But here's the thing. The thing is that generic ketamine is dirt cheap. You can buy a kilo of it from a source manufacturer in India. You can buy a kilo of it for $250. just to do the math, that's somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 therapeutic doses of ketamine. And so you can clearly see that the cost of the generic ketamine is like $1 to $2 per dose after it's been repackaged and gone through the wholesaler and arrived as a medical supply to the provider. So this medicine is dirt cheap. And so that's not where the cost is on this treatment. In fact, the major cost of this treatment is the provider's time. And so my advice to future clients is to be picky about your provider and to make sure that they have adequate skills to help you have an optimal experience with your ketamine treatment and is also qualified to deal with any psychological or medical adverse events that may come up. Those things are somewhat rare, but they do happen, and you want to make sure that your provider is equipped to manage those things. So let's talk about that for a second. One of the things that's interesting about the field of therapeutic ketamine is that there's all kinds of disagreements, all kinds of different ideas about the optimal way to use this tool, to use ketamine for depression. By the way, my specialty is using ketamine for depression, bipolar depression, and suicidal ideation. So I'm going to be sticking to that today because that really is where my expertise lies. But I think what I'm saying is relevant to other sacred medicines and to other kinds of ketamine use. We all know that there's a lot of illicit or unsupervised ketamine use going on. So again, while that's not the focus of my talk, I think it is related to what I'm saying. In any case, there's all different ways to provide ketamine treatment. There's low-dose ketamine infusions, which are typically designed to be sub-psychedelic. They're not in the psychedelic dose range on purpose. You can have ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy, where you're using ketamine embedded in a psychotherapy process. Another way of working with this medicine is to have psychedelic ketamine journeys to induce and invite the mystical properties, the mystical experiences on purpose. In addition, there's the opportunity for group work. Some people do solo work at home where they're taking ketamine by prescription, but by themselves without the presence of a medical or mental health provider immediately there. And again, we're trying to figure out exactly what works the best for whom. And I have a lot to say about that. I'm going to save that for a different day. But the key point here is that all of these different services have different price points. And it's really important for clients and their families and our communities to understand exactly what they're paying for and why, and to make sure that they're getting good value. Because right now, all of ketamine treatment it's largely out of pocket because it's not FDA approved for this indication. So we need to have patients and clients be educated to ask a lot of good questions about what service they're getting. Here's the thing, ketamine with psychotherapy is more expensive than the other forms of ketamine services. And that's because the provider's time is expensive. And it's clear to me, having done this now for 18 years, that ketamine embedded in the context of psychotherapy is often much more effective and has longer lasting results than any other form of ketamine treatment. So this is interesting and important. But again, the problem is that the therapy is expensive. And particularly when you're in a scenario where you have a therapist and a medical provider who are not the same person, but working as a team, okay, now you've got two medical or mental health professionals, and that even further increases the cost. And so what do we do about this problem? And I'll tell you in a minute what I'm going to recommend. Bear with me. But in any case, if you are not getting individual attention from your ketamine provider, you really want to take a good look at exactly what you're paying for. Now that's concerning. Regardless, all good ketamine treatment has 4 essential steps. And so here's what they are. All ethical ketamine treatment includes a patient selection process where patients are assessed for their appropriateness for ketamine treatment. Then there should be some sort of patient preparation where the ketamine provider and the patient meet together to get ready for the ketamine session and the ketamine experience. Then there's the ketamine session itself. And then another important step is the integration or follow-up. What happens after the ketamine treatment to make use of the experience and the information. So if you are a ketamine patient, it's really valuable to step back and make sure that your provider has in fact gone through those steps. They have gone through a careful and selective selection process, that you were adequately prepared for the treatment. You had the treatment, and then there was follow-up psychological care. So if the providers aren't doing all four of those things or mentioning all four of those things, that would be really concerning. And you should be leery of people who want your money, but who aren't doing all four steps in a thorough way. What else do I want to say about this? Another thing that's really important in choosing a provider, some advice I want to give, is that therapeutic ketamine, what we have going on right now, is really the convergence of three different fields, three different areas of expertise. Namely, part of what we know about therapeutic ketamine comes right out of anesthesiology and their expertise in managing the medical safety issues of a medicine like ketamine, which is hypertensive and partially paralytic, et cetera, and so forth. There are some medical safety concerns that need to be attended to in working with ketamine, but that's not the whole story. The patients who are best suited to ketamine treatment are people with severe and refractory depression, ruminative suicidal ideation, bipolar depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc. And there are some skills from psychiatry and psychology that are really relevant to assessing and working with these kinds of patients. The third piece of ketamine treatment, the third domain that we borrow from, is the underground, the psychedelic underground. I have to be honest about this. A lot of what happens in ketamine treatment, it comes right out of the contribution. Hang on a second. Comes right out of psychedelic ketamine. And so any provider who it really is really worth their salt, they need to be knowledgeable about all of these domains. Let me just take a quick check on the time. I should wrap it up. Okay, let me wrap it up. All right. Well, I spent a lot of time talking about things that are important to me. Didn't quite get to everything that I wanted to talk about today, but let me just give some quick advice going forward, and then I'll pass it off to my colleague. Some things that you can do as a ketamine patient if you're seeking services. You can ask a lot of questions of your provider. You can ask for a generic or racemic ketamine, which is dirt cheap. You can ask about the possibility of injectable ketamine, which is the least expensive way of having ketamine treatment. You can ask about whether group ketamine treatment is appropriate for you. And finally, the last thing we need to do is we need to train more clinicians to be competent to use this tool. Having more clinicians in the field will increase the supply of providers, and that will have the effect of bringing the price down. And I think that's a good thing. So anyway, I want to just leave you with one final thought, which is that Rome wasn't built in a day. It's taken me 18 years to get the conversation going on this particular thing. And it's very important that we have conversations about equity and access in this field. And we also have to respect the fact that this is a process and that patience is needed as we try to change agencies and systems and people's ways of thinking. So again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. Let's hear now from Dr. Belser.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Thank you for pointing out and providing such clear and concise questions for both patients and providers to consider when they're working with ketamine-assisted therapies. So next up, we have Dr. Alex Belser. He is a licensed psychologist and psychedelic researcher at Yale University and New York University. He's also a study therapist for the MAPS Phase 3 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD, and is a ketamine therapy specialist. Alex, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Belser. I want to thank the Queen of Ketamine, Raquel, for inviting me to join her today and to to thank her for really leading the way in developing this form of therapy and disseminating the best way to do it. Liana, thanks for moderating. I want to thank Bia and Chacruna and all 1,300 psychonauts and enthusiasts and curious folks who've joined us today. Over the next 15 minutes, I just want to talk about the controversies. I want to get right to the meat of the nut. The controversies around power, conflicts in the space, and perverse incentives around profit versus patient care in the ketamine area. I'm building on the work that Raquel has already articulated in part, and she and I wrote recently an article in the MAPS bulletin that I would like to direct you to. And so one guiding question that I have to ask you is, how do we move from today's current model, which is primarily a wealth concentration model, to a healing distribution model? How can we, as a group, as clinicians, as people in the policy space, envision a new psychedelic mental health care infrastructure? One which is open source rather than proprietary, one which is clinician owned or community owned rather than VC owned, one which is decentralized rather than highly concentrated and centralized, and one which is guided by a principle of compassionate care rather than profit maximization. I'm going to start with the story of one little variant on the ketamine molecule, the story of esketamine. Maybe you've heard of it. So this is maybe one of the biggest psychiatric news stories of the last year. For the last 20 years, we've had no new medicines approved by the FDA for the treatment of depression until esketamine. No new medicines, but no new novel pathways of medicines. So all the old MAOIs, SSRIs, SNRIs, even tricyclics, there's been no new class of drug approved for depression until your mom and dad's pharmaceutical company, Johnson & Johnson, comes out with Spravato or esketamine, a nasal spray. What is esketamine? As Raquel pointed to, racemic or good old generic ketamine is, like many molecules, a mixture of two different enantiomers, a left-handed and a right-handed version of the molecule. It's the same molecule, it just has slightly different angles at points in the molecular structure. And so esketamine is the left-handed molecule, R-ketamine is the right-handed molecule. And because generic ketamine is generic, which means that multiple drug manufacturers can make it, and it's very cheap, this means that Big Pharma has an incentive to monetize small variations on existing drugs. If you wanted to bring a drug to market, what's the average cost to bring a new drug to market? It's about $1 billion. So Big Pharma hedges their bets and looks to existing successful medications like ketamine and says, well, we can't patent ketamine, but maybe we can try to patent esketamine. When that failed, they patented a filtration system, so they filtered out 50% of that molecule. And then they ran it in trials, and the FDA has approved it for treatment-resistant depression. R-ketamine is being brought to market possibly by Atai, which is the largest investor in Compass Pathways, which is bringing psilocybin to market. So we have like a ketamine-psilocybin crossover here. Why do we care about this? Why is this important? The real question is, how do we make money off of generic drugs? Regular ketamine's $2 a dose. Johnson & Johnson's nasal spray of esketamine is $850 for a dose. Huge sticker shock, but perhaps it's warranted. Maybe there's clinical evidence that it has stronger efficacy in treating depression. But unfortunately, sadly, the answer is no. There's no evidence clinically in any trial whatsoever that esketamine is more effective in treating depression than regular old generic off-label ketamine. And so this is a system of perverse incentive. The current system encourages Big Pharma to invent ways to monetize existing generic drugs. They do this by creating proprietary variants. And there's not necessarily any evidence that those variants are any better clinically than existing generic drugs. We see this recently with in the world, and part of what I want to talk about today is how ketamine is a front runner model. We can look in the psilocybin and the MDMA space, where I'm also active, to ketamine, because ketamine is like way ahead of where those two drugs are. And so when you look to the world of psilocybin, Compass Pathways has patented a variant on good old generic mushrooms. psilocybin molecule. They couldn't patent the molecule because it was synthesized by Albert Hofmann many decades ago. But they did synthesize a new crystalline form of psilocybin called COMP360. And so we have these generic drugs coming on that can't be patented, but some small variant like esketamine can. The other thing is that there's an incentive for Big Pharma to take psychedelic drugs and make them as non-psychedelic as possible. So Spravato was intentionally dosed at the lowest possible dose possible so that it just either meets or outperforms placebo in head-to-head trials, sugar pill placebo, right? And so this is, they want to avoid the psychedelic consciousness experience. Whereas I think there's significant benefit in what Raquel was saying in the spiritual, soulful, embodied, visionary properties of psychedelic medicines in the middle and higher dose ranges. And we see that frequently with ketamine. So this is part of a trend where we try to get the psychedelic out of the psychedelics. You see that with MindMed in the ibogaine space. They've taken ibogaine, a variant of it is 18MC that has non-psychedelic properties, but still may be helpful in helping people get off of opioid withdrawal. But they try to get the psychedelic out of it. So I want to take a look at some of these controversies and make some forward-looking recommendations that Raquel and I have discussed and share them with you, because we can't just bemoan the problems of these perverse incentives. We need to think about ways to reform them. And so one step, I want to make 5 recommendations. 1, let's embrace a psychedelic model that is open source rather than proprietary, locally owned rather than owned by somebody far away who's a shareholder, decentralized and distributed rather than highly concentrated, and guided by compassionate care. So many of us, we've been in the space for a long time, and we start having dinners with psychedelic investors who want to get into the space and make millions of dollars. This model, we grow weary of their vision of clinics from sea to shining sea hosting psychedelic medicine, where they're the owners, they and a small cadre of stakeholders, and all of the clinicians and psychotherapists are somehow underlings or subordinates in that. This model concentrates wealth, power, and profit in the hands of a few founders and shareholders. It also requires complex legal gamesmanship, complex corporate structures that create clinical entities that then siphon or funnel profits into a management service organization. The MSO, or management service organization, is an investment vehicle for people who want to invest in the space. And most of the new players are using this model. This current structure also systematically incentivizes hiring less experienced and cheaper psychotherapists. So why pay somebody who's been doing this for 20 years and is a senior clinician in the field when you can get somebody right out of school who has very little experience but still may have their licensure? We need to envision a different model, a healing distribution model. The new future for psychedelic mental health infrastructure should be open source, clinician and community owned, decentralized, guided by the principles of compassionate care. And this approach is consistent with the pollinator approach that Dr. Zellner has put forward, the statement on open practice, of open science and open practice that I'm a signatory to, and the nonprofit clinic model, and the nonprofit models generally that has been developed by places like Nautilus Sanctuary, which is a group of clinicians in New York City. I'm a founder of that organization, and we're looking to develop a nonprofit accessibility model. The second recommendation that I have to share with you is to examine and change the FDA approval process. The key point here is that the current system rewards Big Pharma for making oftentimes irrelevant changes that have little or no clinical value, like the filtration system likely for esketamine. We know that generic ketamine works, but the barriers are so high to bring it to market as an on-label approved treatment for depression or suicidality that it's not going to happen in the current structure, not easily anyway. The third recommendation I have to share is that we need to look at the legal, and I know that people start to sort of glaze over when I talk about corporate ownership laws, but this is actually incredibly important. We need to reform the structural bias. And this is basically a controversy between investors, MDs or physicians, and then other forms of psychotherapists or psychedelic facilitators. So the investor class, to prevent them from running medicine, many states have prohibitions against what's called CPOM, or the corporate practice of medicine. And they basically say, companies that provide medical services have to be owned by medical professionals like medical doctors. That's all fine and good, and that prevents physicians from being under the undue influence of capitalists or venture capital owners. But these rules also then prevent people like me, a psychologist or a very experienced guide who's been doing psychotherapy in the psychedelic space for a long time, from owning or co-owning the same practices with the physician. And so it creates new perverse incentives where anesthesiologists can run, for example, a ketamine clinic, and many of the infusion clinics around the country are owned and operated by anesthesiologists, but some of them don't have any training in psychiatry. They don't have any training in psychotherapy. And so they don't know how to do therapy. And we know that these combinations, working with medicine and with somebody who facilitates, can be incredibly powerful. And so we need to encourage people to operate within their scope of practice under mutual ownership. I'm going to finish up with two more points. We need to acknowledge, the fourth point is acknowledge and compensate our psychedelic teachers. Our psychedelic teachers, as Raquel pointed out, oftentimes have been operating in an underground space or in marginal spaces for many decades, and they are getting pushed out as we move into a legitimate medicalization model by people who often have almost no experience working with these medicines. The fifth point and final recommendation is that we need to address the systemic flaws in our healthcare system that penalize illness. Depression is a debilitating condition. By definition, people who have depression have functional impairment, which means they are less likely to be fully employed. They're less likely to be productive or to make money or to have full in-network healthcare benefits for certain providers. And so this off-label version of ketamine and other psychedelic medicines, it penalizes those people by saying, you're the sickest among us, and we're going to ask you to pay the most for your treatment. This is complete insanity. And I think that everybody sort of understands this, but it makes no sense to penalize that. We should embrace a socialized or communal cost model where the cost of these treatments are shared within a community of people, and we need to get that into standard insurance practice. To finish, ketamine treatment is the crest of a wave. We believe there's a lot to be learned here in the psilocybin mushroom space and the MDMA space from what's happening in this area. Ketamine is dirt cheap and it's generic, and we ought to embrace it. We need to be able to provide group psychotherapy because it's cheaper and oftentimes clinically better. We need to educate our patients to find ways to reduce the cost of treatment, to improve and redress the FDA approval process, to reform the structural bias and who owns the psychedelic future. We need to respect and compensate our psychedelic ancestors, and we need to reduce misuse and harms with this medicine and others. This is how we embody the promise of ketamine as a medicine to heal. We ignore the power and the profit at our own peril. We have to align our economics with our ethics, and such that we build a psychedelic mental health infrastructure that works in the service of equitability, accessibility, and compassionate care. And I think the way we do that is by embracing an open source, clinician, community-owned, decentralized, distributed model with compassionate care at its heart, not profit maximization. So I'm looking forward to your questions with Raquel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Alex, and thank you for providing us some tangible next steps and potential actions that we can take in face of all the issues that you just named with this huge amount of investor money moving into the space. So there are some questions. The first I want to quickly touch on is this question around insurance coverage and whether or not FDA research and passing ketamine-assisted therapy through FDA is the only pathway to receiving insurance coverage.
I'll take a crack at that. By the way, Liana, take a look at your text messages. I just sent you some stuff.
Thanks, Raquel.
I know you're multitasking over there.
Yeah, you're good.
I'm a clinician. I'm not a legal expert or a systems expert. I'm not an expert on those aspects. But it's my understanding that medical insurance doesn't have to cover, is not obligated to cover a treatment that is not FDA approved for that indication. And we all know that lots of medical insurances are profit driven, and they are quick to deny anything that they can possibly not have to pay for. So historically, insurance refused to cover ketamine infusion, which is the most highly researched way of working with ketamine, but certainly not the only way of working with ketamine. They refused to cover ketamine for depression up until about 1.5 years ago. And around that time, insurances began to realize that it was actually more cost effective to provide ketamine treatments in any form to the patients because they improved and they used other services less, like psychiatry, psychotherapy, and medication. And so we don't have great data on this at this point in time. But what I'm trying to say is that some medical insurance companies will in fact approve ketamine treatment upon appeal. It is at their discretion to say yes or no. But until we have FDA approval of generic ketamine for a psychiatric indication, there isn't going to be broad coverage for that. And I think that medical coverage is the key to making this treatment more accessible.
Thank you. Yeah,
can I just jump in for a second on that? Yeah. And I just want to extend what Raquel's saying in this idea that ketamine is a front runner. Of the 250 unique psychedelic compounds that Dr. Alexander Shulgin created, these are all generic molecules, right? There's no profit-driven route to get these to market that were for an on-label indication for anything in the current system. And so these are all orphaned drugs. And so like the plight of orphan drugs and the plight of psychedelics is really the same story. And ketamine is really the only medicine that we can look at and seeing that happening in real time because it's already dictated.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. So I want to move into talking about the impacts of COVID-19. It has necessitated changes in terms of administrating ketamine-assisted therapy. And I know Raquel has commented on this in the past, but I would love for you to share with the group what some of your thoughts are in terms of the changes that have recently occurred.
Yeah, thanks for asking. And thanks everyone for your great questions in the comments and in the questions area. I see them. Very exciting stuff. Wish we had more time. Yeah, so COVID, holy cow. So temporarily, I think that it's not a great idea for people to leave their homes to get ketamine treatment, even when ketamine treatment has been successful in the past. So I think temporarily, as an adaptation to coronavirus and COVID, I think the thing to do is to switch as many patients as possible to at-home ketamine treatment using ketamine lozenges. And I actually put this in writing on my website. So if you go to the CREO website, you can find that. Here's the thing, working with ketamine lozenges at home has some advantages and some challenges. So let's talk about that for a quick moment. The advantages to working with ketamine at home, this is completely legal, by the way, to get a prescription for ketamine lozenges if you meet the medical and psychological criteria. So the advantages is that it brings the cost down and it's convenient, and it eliminates the transportation problem with ketamine treatment. And it's empowering to patients that they can take medicine, a PRN, in other words, as needed. So I like that. I like the possibility of increasing accessibility through this way of working with ketamine. But there are a couple of problems that we need to be really mindful of. So here's some of the problems. We need to be careful about patients using ketamine inappropriately, being diverted, patients using it too much and becoming dependent. I don't want to see that. Or patients becoming tolerant. That sometimes happens if you have unsupervised or unlimited access to a powerful tool. And worse than that, there's some other things that could really go wrong. Sometimes patients accidentally hurt themselves while under the influence of ketamine. For example, falling down the stairs or something like that. So broken bones, that can be a real problem. Even worse, if someone makes the grave error of driving while under the influence of ketamine, please don't do that. Now you're putting the community at risk. You could hurt someone in a very serious way. So that's a real problem. And finally, accidental death. There's been a couple of reported drownings of people who died while under the influence of ketamine and probably other substances too, but who drowned and lost their lives where ketamine was in the mix. It's not clear that was prescribed ketamine, but that's sort of beside the point. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of negatives to working with ketamine at home. For that reason, I have not been a fan of it up until now. But this is an exceptional time, and I think we need to make adaptations to the current situation. I just want to say one more thing, which is, I know that we're just about out of time here, but I got a lot of pushback from some people, some ketamine providers, about the recommendations that I posted regarding COVID, and specifically. There are a lot of wonderful providers who are really heartful and generous in their work, but there was a few providers who seemed very concerned about the impact on their income stream if we switch to at-home ketamine. Specifically, they're concerned that if they could have ketamine at home, that the patients wouldn't want to come back to the office for in-office ketamine treatment, injections or infusions, which are more expensive. And so I think it remains to be seen what happens, but potentially COVID is going to transform the landscape of ketamine treatment. And it's something that I'm watching with great interest. It's hard to know what's going to happen, but I think we should all be very mindful of the advantages and disadvantages of unsupervised use of sacred medicines.
Thank you for that. There is some couple top voted questions that I want to be sure to touch on. One is wondering if the Kriya Institute will be offering more trainings for therapists and perhaps online. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Yes. Well, I don't know. I'm working on it. Yes. So I have organized 5 international conferences for the ketamine community in the past, and I've trained hundreds and potentially thousands of clinicians. And so doing clinical training is a huge part of my job. I'm currently on sabbatical to write a book about ketamine treatment. And I'm thinking about adding a webinar series to complement that. And so if you would like to be notified about future training opportunities through Kriya, please go to my website and add yourself to my mailing list, and then I'll keep you posted about all the developments. That's all I'm able to say at this time.
Great. And if there's quite a few questions about trainings and recommendations for training. So perhaps Alex and Raquel can add some links into the chat over here. I'd like to move on to this other top voted question, which says from Robin, it says, please compare the nature of the ketamine experience versus other psychedelics and how those changes dictate or suggest appropriate conditions. This is really a question about set and setting as it relates specifically to ketamine and in comparison.
Well, Dr. Belser has a lot of experience with some of the other psychedelic studies, so I'd like to defer to him.
I'm going to jump to the conclusion, which is how I like to talk about this with my friends who are really into psychedelics. Ketamine is the most underestimated of the psychedelic medicines by a country mile. I was in the space for 18 years, going to psychedelic conferences, learning about the phenethylamines and serotonergics, and having really no understanding of ketamine other than like a club drug that some people used. I had no idea. I think that we vastly underestimate the psychedelic visionary properties of this medicine when used well in a supportive context, in a bond of trust with the facilitator and provider. And so it's hard to describe. I think the ketamine's gotten a bad rap and oftentimes is stigmatized. It's been stigmatized as horse tranquilizer, even though it's the most widely used human anesthetic in the world today. It's on many crash carts around the country. It's gotten stigmatized as producing a K-hole, which is like an unpleasant, unsupported experience that people may have when they're at the club and they take too much of a medicine. It's been stigmatized as a white powder. I think that it suffers from stigma because some of the best ways of taking the medicine is with an IM intramuscular injections, so people don't like needles. And I understand all of this. But if you can sort of take those prejudices and put them aside, the medicine itself, in terms of the phenomenology at different dosage ranges with different routes of administration, produces something that can be incredibly healing. Not just producing a medical effect to reduce depression, but people describe all manner of experiences in many of the same ways that you'll see when you interview them, people who take psilocybin or take 5-MeO-DMT or take ayahuasca or take MDMA even. I will say this, a recent study looked at near-death experiences, hundreds of accounts of NDEs, near-death experiences, from people who had actually had them, car crashes, operating room experiences. And they took all of their writings and they compared them systematically through a computational linguistic analysis to trip reports on Erowid across all the different drugs. And so they looked at cacti and plant medicine and all sorts of the Shulgin compounds. Of all of the compounds, of the hundreds of trip reports, tens of thousands of trip reports and hundreds of compounds, which on Erowid, which one do you think most closely resembled the near-death experience? Ketamine. And so when you look at the NDE, people come into a new awakening of themselves. And I think we're just beginning to chart that. And so I'm not saying it's all rosy, it's all easy. It's not. But it can be a beautiful medicine. And I think because it grew up under the umbrella of medicine, like Western medicine, rather than plant or indigenous medicine, it has yet to really be understood for what it can possibly provide as a medicine.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, can I come in on that? That's great.
Yeah, sure.
I'm aware that it's lunchtime after this, and so I'm okay with going a few minutes over if you guys are. It's up to you, Liana.
I have a session directly after this but I'm also not sure if the system kicks us out, but I'm happy to go another, what are you thinking, 10 minutes or so?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Yeah, there are a lot of questions I think would be great to get to. So yeah.
Yeah, so can I come in can I add to what Dr. Belser said?
Absolutely, yeah.
There's two things I really want to make sure that I say, and thank you everyone for your questions. So the first thing is something that I've noticed in my own personal exploration. By the way, the statute of limitations has run out, so I'm allowed to talk about what I did in the past. My lawyer says that it's all right. But in any case, serotonergic agents, things like MDMA and psilocybin and LSD, one of the things that they have in common is that they can function as like a magnifying glass or a focusing lens that under the influence or working with those medicines when they are your ally, you can use those medicines to go into, I'm kind of pointing down, to get into, to look at, to examine something historical from your own biographical history and to kind of like untangle a knot or to really like be with something from your story that needs some attention. So the serotonergic agents kind of lend themselves to that kind of work, I think. But in contrast, to answer the question, ketamine does something different. It's a glutamatergic agent. It's primarily acting in the glutamate pathway. And ketamine takes you the other direction. It takes you out like that. It's dissociative, and it temporarily takes you away from who you think you are. And your story, whatever happened to you in the past, it kind of disintegrates in a particular dose range. It really just doesn't matter anymore. And you're like a bird flying up higher and higher above the beach, and you kind of lose track of the little individual grains of sand. It's like that. And so what I mean to say is that the serotonergic agents take you toward your story, and the glutamatergic agents take you away. They're actually opposite and complementary. So one thing that interests me a great deal, so I hope that answers the original question about how it compares. One thing that interests me a great deal in the future is the possibility of studying combinations like MDMA and ketamine together for the treatment of depression or trauma. Please don't try this at home, but rather it's an interesting research area. I think Liana had to go, but I'm going to just talk another couple of minutes.
I'm still here. Raquel?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to hang out for another 5 minutes.
Okay, great. The other thing that I wanted to say on the same topic is the following, which is that in my experience, all optimal sacred medicine experience has 4 elements. And those 4 elements are a wisdom teaching, where somebody provides you with guidance about how to navigate this crazy world, and a relational container where there's mutual love and respect and care and concern between the provider and the journeyer. There is optimal, that's three. Optimal setting. The setting has to be physically safe and set up appropriately and quiet. And finally, the sacred medicine. And so any exploration that people do that doesn't include all four of those elements, I think it's probably suboptimal. So in that sense, ketamine is very much like the other sacred medicines, in that I think the most expansive, most beautiful experience are had when all four of those elements are in place.
Thank you so much for that and for those 4 points and putting it in that way.
Would you please ask us about investors?
Yeah, I was actually going to go a different direction, but yeah, let's talk about investors. I know that Alex covered quite a bit on this, on the vision for having decentralized ownership. I've personally had the question that if people are looking to establish psychedelic clinics, why aren't there funding sources such as low interest loans? And wouldn't that be more beneficial? And wouldn't that suit the needs more accurately to what the community is hoping to build? And so, yeah, what would your commentary be in terms of investors who are interested in investing in and rapidly scaling access to ketamine-assisted therapies?
Well, I'll take a crack at this and I'd be interested to hear what Dr. Belser has to say as well. But it's unclear to me that there's a need for investors in this space at all. Because in my opinion, the right place for ketamine treatment is under the umbrella of really excellent, top quality psychiatric and psychological care. And I don't see the value. I don't see the point of having clinics devoted to psychedelics. I really don't see the point of even having psychedelics outside of the context of a psychotherapy or spiritual counseling relationship. And so I understand conceptually that we may need to have psychedelic clinics as a stepping stone toward legalization. So I do appreciate, what MAPS is trying to do there. But anyway, here's the problem. When you have an investor, most often that implies that they're expecting a return on their investments. And that usually implies that they're wanting to profit and potentially wanting to maximize profit. So I just don't think there's any space for any of that in excellent healthcare. I have a lot more to say about this. I'm going to stop myself. Did you want to add anything, Alex?
I mean, I will direct people if they're interested to the recent MAPS bulletin that tackles a lot of this, including Raquel and I, Dr. Bennett and I wrote up an article together about that. I'll just say that the people with capital vastly outgun the people without capital. And the current system is so skewed to give the high ground to people with access to large reservoirs of capital that has to be, it's not really even a race or an even competition in any way, shape, or form. We've been trying to start a nonprofit organization in New York, Nautilus Sanctuary, for example, and the incentive for us to accept investment, the offers of investment are vastly outpace the way that we would try to do this ourselves. And I think that we see this time and time again in the American and also many industrialized countries' healthcare systems that don't really provide a path forward for these orphan drugs. And the idea that the patient's needs would be well aligned with the needs of the owners of a facility is, of course, ridiculous. And yet that's what we sort of assume in some way. The tort laws in the country are really screwy, which means that you want to avoid anything that's even remotely risky, even if it has maximal benefit and may be best for the patient in the short and long term, including inducing or inviting psychedelic consciousness. It's seen as an unwanted side effect, a delirium that we should avoid at all costs. So let's give them lots and lots and lots of sessions over many weeks at a very low dose, because heaven forbid somebody has a psychedelic consciousness experience with these medicines. And so that is the model that we are, I think, struggling with and working towards. And I appreciate some of the thoughtful commentary that people have brought to bear on how to reform that together.
I would love to end on this note, just to say that I advise the community to be cautious about whether you are purchasing ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy or accessing that experience in the context of relationship and in the context of therapy, which is focused on the patient's clinical mental health needs, or whether now what we have is some people coming into the field who are selling psychedelic experience as a standalone experience. And they have very slick marketing teams and lots of venture capital behind them, this, that, and other thing. And they're doing the absolute minimum that they have to do in order to be legal. But they, in fact, are clearly not emphasizing relationship or mental health care. So these are two different models now that are coming into conflict with each other. Right now, as we speak, my inbox is loaded up with these emails. And so I think that's a conversation that we need to continue to have going forward.
Thank you. And Alex, I wanted to ask one more question. I know we're out of time here, but there was a question here which says, from Andrew Carroll, which says, I've read your work on queer representation in psychedelic research. What can new LGBTQ identifying clinicians do to get involved in psychedelic research? So this is a question for both of you, and I'd love to hear your response.
Wow. Well, I mean, Dr. Bennett's raising her hand. I'm raising my hand as a queer person in the field. I would point people to a couple of resources. The Queering Psychedelics Conference that Chacruna also hosted in San Francisco last year. I had a chance to speak there and give like a nice hour-long talk about exactly this point. So I will toot my own horn a little bit and direct people towards that talk, which was so much fun to give to a room full of trans, queer, gay, bi, pan, gender nonconforming, POC individuals. It was really moving. We see too often that this space is dominated people who look like me, who are white, cisgender men of privilege with access to capital, and that marginalized peoples, including queer people, are kept at the margins, oftentimes, or in some sort of supportive role. And I think that Chacruna on the whole is doing incredible work to promote that. And I hope that we see a reprise of Queering Psychedelics. And I want to encourage all of the queer folks out there in this audience to think about how these medicines are queer. They are very non-normative medicines. And I don't just mean in the sexual way, in the embodied way, in the visionary way, and in the way that queer folks build and bridge communities between and amongst ourselves, oftentimes in opposition to existing structures of power. And I think that that is incredibly psychedelic.
Right on. Thank you so much. Is there any other final commentary from our panelists here before we close?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Liana, for hosting us today. Everyone enjoy the rest of your conference.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, this concludes this afternoon session here. And please join us back. I believe the time is 2 p.m. I should really know that. I will actually be speaking next with my co-founder from North Star, Kat Codenauer. So if you're interested to dive even deeper into the massive questions around how the psychedelic community can forge a pathway forward that doesn't perpetuate the systemic problems of business as usual, please join us for that session. And thank you all for all the questions and commentary, and enjoy lunch.